normally the classroom is like a really lively discussion, and it's fun, because I'm really serious about this stuff, and I'm really serious about what it says, and I care about it. But I'm also not that serious as a person, and I don't want the classroom to be a super serious place. I want it to be fun. And all of this stuff gets way more interesting when it comes into contact with y'all, when all these different perspectives and jokes and doubts and preconceptions and reflections, when they all get going together and we start to become, kind of friends. That's what's cool. That's what I like about teaching. That's what I think I'm good at nurturing, or at least it's something good that happens when I teach. But here I am allegedly teaching, but really I'm just fucking talking to myself on my porch. It's weird. So the thought I had was, what would be cool? If anybody ever watches this shit, then maybe you can get back to me on this one. It'd be cool if some evening some of us could agree to meet up and have a drink or something. Like to materialize the class for a moment in like a pleasant way. That'd be cool. Maybe it's just that, I feel like having a drink. This is tea. The other thing is just like passing thought. So you've been hanging out inside my studio. This is outside the studio. I didn't build this myself exactly, but I sort of did. I worked with two other guys and I built this. I designed it and put it here and everything. So I guess in part I'm putting it in the video because I'm kind of proud of it, but also because I don't have anywhere else to do this stuff. Okay, so let me get into Marx. And I'm going to try and give you Marx as thoroughly as I can without going on too long or becoming too rambly. I'm going to tell you about Marx and Engels, Marx in particular, as character, their historical circumstance. And then I want to get into a few of the themes of Marxism and a few of the themes that I think are presented in the Communist Manifesto. And then I'll try and turn these into questions like usual. So, the time period. Communist Manifesto is written and released in 1848, same as the year of on civil disobedience by Thoreau, the last lecture. That year, as you may recall from the Arendt lecture and from the Robespierre lecture, that year 1848 was huge. Maybe it's worth saying some of the stuff that Marx himself will say, but by way of setup. Capitalism radically changed the face of Europe in the same way that it then extended outward and radically changed the face of the entirety of the globe. Capitalism is a global phenomenon, and it was becoming that phenomenon. I tend to think the seeds of capitalism are there in the 1500s with families like the Medici, because they were a family that started in the wool trade, and then they shifted over into banking, and they became the wealthiest banking family in Europe at that point. That kind of accumulation of money, and then like in the banking scenario, you lend out the money and you get it back, with interest, or you give it out as venture capital for people to do businesses, and then you get money back as interest. That looks like capitalism to me, but it's not full capitalism because the legal and property structures which were in place at that time were not yet fully capitalistic. So it took the American and the French revolutions especially to place capitalism at center stage and to facilitate its global explosion. Already globalization was underway from the beginning of this class. We're looking at something like the beginning of globalization. When the Spanish take over the New World, when they discover the Americas, they open up all these new markets, they bring in all this new money for Spain. Spain starts to develop itself as a super moneyed power on the basis of this. So this is all one process of expansion, but it's really getting going in the 1800s. One of the features of capitalism is that it tends to, and I talked about this before too, it tends to displace people. And in this respect, this is an important thing in Marx and Engels. In this respect, they'll say, capitalism itself is revolutionary. When you see this moneyed business class in the United States raise itself to power above a monarch, to liberate itself from a monarch and to enthrone free trade as a centerpiece of its functioning, you're seeing capitalism rise. When, especially in France, the merchant owning class, so even people who were in the assembly, who were proponents of revolution, were a good portion of them, or a certain portion of them, were moneyed people. They were business people. They were merchants, and they are the ones who, under Napoleon, under the Directory first, and then under Napoleon, and then even in the period leading up to where we are now, they're the people who get into power. And even though they put kings back in place, technically, in France, for the first half of the 1800s, it's really the business class, the capitalist class that is in power. Those revolutions enthrone capitalism. And then, of course, the United States, France at that point, takes over Europe and impresses its imprint on Europe. The United States, of course, becomes, by this point in history, the sole superpower. These are facilitating conditions for the growth and spread of capitalism. And in 1848, in Europe, this stuff had been going on for a while. It's throwing everything into upheaval. It's taking... that was my kid yelling at me, I think. Anyway, I guess he's done. Taking people from the countryside and taking over their land. For example, in England, as automated production got going, it got started first in the textile industries. And so this great new capacity to manufacture tons of clothing appeared, and that spiked the demand for raw materials for clothing, especially wool. So landowners who for centuries had been allowing their serfs, or the peasants around them, I guess they weren't technically serfs, the peasants in their vicinity, to live on and use portions of the land that were technically deeded to them. And so by practice, centuries of practice, this was peasant land that they used to raise their subsistence food, and then common areas that they used for getting firewood, they used for grazing their animals, this kind of stuff. As the demand for wool grew, these landowners, who had probably become, somewhat decrepit in the same way as the Marquis, their old glory may have been fading. They needed money, they wanted money, and so they pushed the peasants off the land in order to take it over, in order to raise their own sheep. And where there had previously been peasants, now there was a raw material called wool. What happens to those peasants? They get pushed into the city, and they become part of the original labor force, industrial labor force. This kind of change is happening all across Europe, and especially in the wake of the French Revolution, changes, ideological changes, and family changes, and patterns of social behavior changes were going on all over the place. And the conditions of the working poor just got worse and worse. So go read, pretty much any Charles Dickens, and you'll see, Oliver Twist or something. You'll see the working conditions in England, the first mechanized place. People are working 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Children, 8-year-olds, 7-year-olds, are working in these unventilated factories. The ventilation is so poor that people are passing out and getting sick. Everything's unsafe. Shit catches fire. People have to live in tenements. They're living, 20 people to 2 rooms. It's misery, and it's unhealthy, and it's painful, and it's brutal. The machinery is not safe. People are getting their fingers ripped off and their arms ripped off on a regular basis. This is industrial reality. And as a result of this massive upheaval caused by the expansion of capitalism and the toppling of these old unjust, unequal, but relatively static systems, feudal systems, in the wake of the destruction of those previous traditional systems, we now have turbulence, social turbulence. We also have population growth. We have massive increase in production. We have total changes in the landscape and in the infrastructure, because the more trade you've got going on, the more manufacturing you've got going on, the more roads you need, the more transportation you need. We got the steam engine. All these changes are happening, and they're changing to the detriment of the working class. And so there are tens of thousands of revolts in Europe in the 1800s. And the key ones from a French perspective would have been 1830 and then 1848. And 1848, the year of the Communist Manifesto, is a year in which nearly every single country in Europe saw a massive revolt, almost enough to topple whole governments. And they just barely fail. So when Marx and Engels are writing this Communist Manifesto, they're not just like dreaming of some, moment way far off in the future where everybody could be free and stuff. They were thinking about their present. They were thinking that this could be the year. That they were thinking that, Europe-wide and ultimately global revolution on the part of the working class to take over this new super powerful means of production, which could produce volumes of goods unprecedented in human history. They were thinking, hey man, it's time for the vast majority of the population who to this point are being exploited to take over those means of production. They thought it was happening right then. Okay, so that's their historical context. What about Marx and Engels as people? If you want, you can pick on them really easy, because Engels' dad, the reason that Marx was able to spend most of his life in libraries, researching and writing, and then to move around from country to country, because these guys, both of them, to their credit, they're not just theorists. I mean, Marx is a philosopher and economist of the first order, hands down. Doesn't matter if you hate him and you think everything he says is wrong. Like, his influence and the quality of his writing and thought is high. How are they able to do these things? Because Engels' dad owned factories in England. So it was capitalist money. Oh, and then Marx mooched off of Engels, basically, and drank a lot of red wine, too, I understand. So it was by capitalist money that these revolutionaries were able to be revolutionaries. So they had, rich guy money funding the revolt of the poor. And that may seem like a fundamental contradiction. I suppose it is. Although it may also be the case that in a capitalist society, ultimately, all significant money has to be gotten from the capitalists because they are bogarting that shit. They're taking it. It is theirs. Anyway, that'll be it for the introduction. Let's move straight into some of the key concepts that Marx and Engels want to discuss. And by the way, there's two sets of notes that you can look at. The main one is this one. This isn't straight off of the Communist Manifesto, but it's my attempt to define a whole lot of the terms that show up in there. And I do mention Louis Althusser once in a while, who's just a neo-Marxist from 1968 who develops some Marxist theory. I used to talk about him in class a lot this time around. And then there's another one, which is like a PowerPoint. And this one focuses primarily on the theory of ideology, which is something I want to get to before I'm done talking here. So, let's see where to start. Let's start with history. The Communist Manifesto starts off by telling a history, and it's the history that I just started telling you. It's a history that says, look, say in the history of Europe, there has been a history of class relations, a history of domination. So it's not like capitalism introduces domination into the world. There was domination under the feudal system. There was domination in the ancient world. In Rome, which was a slave state, in Greece, which was a set of slave states in large part, there was domination. But domination takes different forms as it moves through history. And there is change through history. This is important to Marx. Marx, in fact, thinks that history is moving towards a fundamental goal, that things change in a single direction and are headed towards a single place. That single place, by the way, is a global society in which the whole of the working population controls everything and they don't have to have a government anymore. That would be communism. But where all production is centralized and rationalized and scientifically guided. That's kind of their vision of communism. So what's changing in history? Well, a few basic things. Population is growing, and different technologies are developing. And as different technologies, especially technologies as they're implemented in production, industrial production, these drive other changes or are related to other changes. So obviously social structures are changing in history. So, if we go back to the ancient world, we have, like Roman patrician farmers controlling slave labor. If we move up to the feudal era, then we have this very hierarchical sort of pyramidal scheme with sometimes a king at the top, and then vassals, feudal lords. You have similar all the way down to peasants and serfs, and a similar structure for other institutions as well. So hierarchical church structure. You have the Pope, and then you got the cardinals, and then you got the bishops, and then you got the everyday priests, and so on. Social structures like this, meaning structures of domination, structures that determine who's in charge, who's not, who controls land, who doesn't. Those change in history, and I've just indicated another key thing that changes in history, which is property relations and property law. In fact, on a Marxist analysis, the ruling class is always the one that has real property. And the property that is in question here is not the property of you owning like the notebook that you're taking notes with right now, or you owning the computer that you're sitting in front of. He doesn't really care about that. It's big property. It's the property that the feudal lords had. What was the nature of their property? They were landed gentry. They owned land. And the thing about land is people have to have it in order to live. That's how you grow food. You have to have land to grow food. But the serfs didn't have their own land. Therefore, they had to use the lord's land. Now that makes it sound like they're just a bunch of lazy bastards or whatever, but that's not really how it is. The feudal lord controlled that territory by force. And probably, definitely the way that feudal structures are put into place is that smaller and more widely distributed land holdings, control of land by local villagers and sharing of land by local villages is increasingly replaced by domination by lords who are expanding their territories. But their ruling position corresponds to a particular form of property, the property that consists in holding land. This changes when we get to the capitalist period, because to begin with, a capitalist, or the bourgeois, which is Marxist term, but it really just comes from French typical usage. The bourgeois, technically speaking, are the people who own the means of production. So I think when Marx is first writing this stuff, he's thinking about factories. He's thinking about industrial production. In fact, he really wants to think about the whole world in terms of industrial production at least. Those people owned factories, they owned machines, they owned the means by which to produce what other people need to live. And this was the foundation of their power. It's a different form of property. When capitalism gets really developed, and with this we can look at Lenin and the 20th century, it stops having to do fundamentally with ownership over factories, etc. And it becomes sheer control over large amounts of money. Capital, that's capital. Here's the definition of capital. Capital is accumulated value, which is perpetually reinvested in productive processes resulting in commodities, which commodities then are sold on the market and return a value, hopefully, which is greater than the full set of costs involved in production, including wages, amortization of machinery, power supplies, all this stuff. You put in a bunch of money, you get some money back, and you hope that the money that you get back is more than you started with. And if so, then the concentration of value that you started with has grown. That is capital. Capital is concentrated money involved in this circuit of self-amplification. And that is what capital fundamentally does. There's no limit to capitalism, by the way. This is, another place in Marx's favorite, most famous book, Das Kapital, which is just capital. He distinguishes between a potentially rational system of production and trade and capitalism. He's like, okay, think of a small farmer. When a small farmer produces, he produces for a market. He raises things that he knows that he can sell. He produces a commodity, say a certain volume of grain. He takes that to town and he sells it and he gets money. Then he uses that money to buy everything he and his family need. He provides for the food and the clothing, maybe the education of his family, and he takes care of his business costs, like whatever machinery he needs, whatever repairs he needs, he pays for. And then he's pretty close to broke again, and he has to start over. So this is a kind of non-accumulating circuit. This is also pretty much what goes on with workers in general. I get a paycheck, well, I work to get a paycheck, producing shit for other people, or in my case, producing certified students who are supposed to be good workers for the capitalists. I work to get my paycheck. My paycheck comes in. I take that paycheck and I use it to pay for all the things I need to pay for. So my mortgage, my car payment, my credit card payment, my equity line payment, my clothing, my kids' education, the books I need in order to teach. Maybe, if I'm lucky, I get to buy a synthesizer once every 2 years or so. But for the most part, my money comes in, I spend it in order to live, I'm broke again. Now that's a sort of naturally limiting cycle, right? Like you only need so much money in order to live. But the cycle that is distinctive of capital, which he describes as MCM prime, it starts as money, it becomes a commodity, and then it comes back as a different amount of money. That cycle is oriented towards perpetual accumulation, and there is no top limit. It's not like capitalists, cash out at some point. They're like, "Whew, I made it. I now have $1 billion, and thank you for playing. I'm so proud that I was able to compete. I have won at capitalism." There's no such thing. There's no limit. And Marx thought that this was one way, and there are other key ones. Maybe I'll mention one or two in a second. One key way in which capitalism is fundamentally irrational. It doesn't have a limit. It lets people pursue greed indefinitely. And the Marxist view, and this is my view too, is that they're not going to stop. Profit making will not stop unless it is made to stop. As billionaires get more and more wealth, they also get more and more power to get more and more wealth. That is not a self-limiting circuit. It has to be limited from outside by the class that the bourgeoisie produces in order to allow it to become so wealthy, namely the proletariat. Those people who generate the value which the capitalists then take as their own profit. I'll come back to that. Second way in which capitalism is irrational from this perspective. Marx is concerned with production, and he's concerned, and he wants people to think about themselves as producers. Like that's what you do. You want to understand your real material conditions. You want to get away from like religious, like kind of fluffy bullshit ideology and stuff. You want to really understand your place in the world scientifically. Start by thinking about what you do all day long. Start by thinking about your labor. Anyway, so production is first of all oriented towards the satisfaction of needs, right? That's the basis even of capitalism, which trades so much in luxury goods. The first thing that it always does is offer commodities to be bought in order to live on, food and housing and clothing and so on. But capitalists aren't particularly concerned with people's needs. They're concerned with profit. And that means that if and when they discern or can produce a market, even for ridiculous bullshit, like, I don't know, the sparkly stuff. Kids like sparkles, right? Kids and like ravers and party people like to put sparkles all over themselves. Sparkles are, what are sparkles anyways? Like little pieces, cut up pieces of shiny paper or something, right? How much capital and how much human labor goes into the production of glitter? Nobody needs glitter. It's just like bullshit that people like to play with. Nobody needs it. But if a capitalist discerns the possibility of putting in a certain amount of money to produce glitter, and they see that, well, glitter sales are at, X amount right now, they see that they're going to be able to get a profit back on that. They're going to make litter, and they're going to make keychains, and they're going to make stuffed animals, and they're going to make a shit ton of plastic goods, and they're going to make 19 different varieties of candy bar. This is an irrational system. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's saying like, hey, human labor and natural resources and all of our technology, they have to be used in order to satisfy the needs of people, and they ought not to be overused, because then we're not going to have any left. And besides, people shouldn't have to work their whole life. They should be able to have like lots of leisure to develop their intellect and their capacity to reason and their judgment and their sociality, and they should have time to love and make music and party. And these are, I think, reasonable goals, every damn one of them. There's nobody in charge in capitalism who's saying such a thing. The people in charge are a number of people, sometimes in cahoots, often in cahoots, but also competing with one another. And none of them has in mind, like, okay, let's act so as to fulfill the needs of the population. In this respect, capitalism is an irrational system. And the one that Marx and Engels and socialists in general would like to put in place is one where you keep the same machinery. They're not anti-technical. They're not anti-technological progress. They're not ecologically minded either. Like that whole thing about running out of resources, that's my idea, not theirs. That's a weird thing. That's another discussion. I think people in 1840, at least in Europe, they just were not even capable of thinking that, like, oh shit, our population and our industrial scale has now got us to the point where everything happens globally and we can run out of things. They never thought that. Anyway, the system that they wanted to put in place, I would just call socialism. And the idea of socialism is that you use the resources and the labor that you have available in order to satisfy the needs of the population. And so there has to be a scientific endeavor. And of course, this is quite complex, but scientists do complex shit all the time, so this is not impossible. There has to be some determination about, like, okay, our population is this big. We live in a climate that's like, relatively cold in the winter. So we're going to need clothes. Everybody's going to need clothes and boots. And we need this amount of, food stored up, because, back here where we had a drought and a famine, we didn't have this much. So there have to be calculations about what needs to be produced. And there has to be calculations about how to distribute it. Now, of course, this runs immediately into problems that people have with socialism, and which are legit problems. Which is, well, who's going to make that determination? Doesn't that imply like a kind of expert, it would become Politburo, an expert core, which will determine everything for everybody else. And if you have that, don't you have domination again? And I think the answer to that is yeah, unfortunately. The anarchist model would prefer that we do production in that way, but that we decide about everything, about how we're going to use resources, how we're going to use labor, where we're going to make one thing or another, that we should decide about it in an absolutely direct, democratic way. That's the system I favor. Anyway, so capitalism is crazy, and now capitalism has taken over. But they think that capitalism also is bound to destroy itself, because capitalism produces two classes. It necessarily produces two classes. It produces the owners of the means of production on this hand. That's the bourgeois. And we can call them capitalists if you want. And I would call them, you could talk about corporations really. And then on the other hand, it produces the proletariat. Now the proletariat is, just generally speaking, anybody who doesn't have control over the means of production themselves. If you don't own a factory, if you own a house that you rent to somebody else, you're petty bourgeois, small bourgeois. You own something, and this is the kind of property that Marxists and socialists think ought to be outlawed. If you own a house that somebody else rents, then what that legally amounts to is that, think about it, so if you know about owning houses, you own a house, you have to pay a mortgage, unless you're lucky enough to have that all paid off or you got it from your parents. There's a mortgage. It costs to have a house. So you're paying every month. Say you're paying $2,000 a month. But then you own another house, and that one has a mortgage too. But the people who are living there are going to pay you $3,000 a month. So what are they doing? Like you own property. In a capitalist society, you have the right to rent that out. You have the right to your own property. This is private property rights. what that right is not really a right to just own your house. It's a right to use this asset, this means of the production of life, this thing which is necessary for people to live, shelter, to use control over this shelter in order to extort money from those people. And look what happens. They give you the $3,000 a month. It covers the $2,000 mortgage over here. So and as that mortgage gets paid down, that's equity for you, right? So these people, if you have property, you have the right to absorb other people's money and make that your property too. Property laws facilitate the growth of economic inequality. And then their $1,000 goes over here and pays part of your mortgage too. So because you started off in a better situation, now you're in a position to exploit those who are in a worse position. Take this on a bigger scale. Think about like big housing complexes. You own that whole thing. What does that ownership amount to? It amounts to the right to tap in to the market of people who don't own their own houses. Nobody who owns their own house is going to go live in an apartment somewhere. Well, very few people. Maybe there are some side reasons you might want to do that, but for the most part, I'm not going to live in a small apartment if I own my own house. So it's people who need somewhere to live. I mean, and of course, this is what's going on in LA, right? We have housing shortage. There's a market of people just trying to satisfy this basic need of life, namely shelter. And the owner of that big building, the law that says that building is his, is in a position where the law is defending his right to absorb money from poorer people and to make it his own. That's private property. Okay, so you have two classes. You have the owner of these things. Petty bourgeois. Petty just means small, right? And it's not the petty bourgeois that Marx is concerned about. It's big owners. It's big companies, ultimately. For us today, it's Halliburton and Exxon and Raytheon and I'm trying to think. Trump Industries, is that the name of his shit? He probably owns a whole bunch of different things. He's the bourgeoisie. He's the class enemy. He's the landlord, And then there's another class, and the other class is everybody who doesn't have that. And because we don't have the means of life for ourselves, for our loved ones, for our children, we have no option but to go out and find work. Marx always equates this to prostitution. We don't have full-on slavery, old school slavery anymore, where technically one body is owned by another body. But we do have slavery during the day while we're at work. When I go to work, my job's pretty good. I'm not that alienated at my job. When I had that telemarketing job, that sucked. You go to work and you have to do what they tell you to do. And if you don't, you get fired, and then you got to find someone else to employ/exploit you, or else your kids won't eat. That's the condition of the proletariat. We have to find our exploiters. That's the parallel with prostitution. We're not slaves. We're not owned by somebody who's going to exploit us. But we have to find somebody to exploit us on a periodic basis. Now, generally speaking, the proletariat is everybody who doesn't own the means of production. Specifically, he thought that the proletariat excluded, say, like homeless people, unemployed people. The proletariat was the working class, people who work in factories. Like, that was his initial understanding. And they have special characteristics. For one thing, Marx thought that, well, maybe we should back up. I told you what capital is. Where does capital really come from? On the model that I told you, it comes from sale, right? You buy low, sell high. The laws of supply and demand are at work. Marx recognizes that those things exist. But he thinks that they exist at a slightly more superficial level than something else. And the something else has to do with labor. So think about all the things that a capitalist needs to buy in order to produce stuff. What's the total monetary output at the beginning of a productive cycle? So there's rent or mortgage, there's taxes, I suppose, there's the machinery, there's the raw materials, and then there's labor. Now, all these other things, all the competitors are buying them the same, right? And Marx's thought is that the value of a commodity is basically determined by the amount of value that goes into it. So if I use fancier materials, they cost me more, I'm going to charge you more for them. But there's one of these commodities that is different from the others, and that commodity is labor. Now we should even talk about that. Under capitalism, labor is a commodity, right? Labor power is a commodity. And from a materialist perspective, so Marx is a materialist, he doesn't believe in God, he's an atheist. He thinks we have to look at just what unfolds really in the world and not think things about souls and shit that we can't see. If you think from that perspective, what is labor? Well, labor is life. Labor is your life. It requires energy. It's the set of your motions in time. And it requires your intellect too. It requires attention. It is your being for a certain period of time. And that is what is for sale on a market under capitalism. You are still bought and sold. Slavery is not over. It's just taken a new form. Anyway, so they buy your labor, but labor is a special commodity because the cost of labor and what labor can produce are different from one another. The basic idea is that I cost a certain amount. And this is true for sure for professors, and especially adjunct professors who are exploited as shit. They pay me, I make about $20 an hour probably. And I teach also at private schools, and what students pay there is insane. I taught a graduate course at Claremont University last semester, and I think we calculated something crazy, like each student there was paying like $4,000 just to take that class, times 15 students. So what the hell is that? That's 40,000 plus, it's like $60,000. And I got what? I got 5,000. So what they can make off of me is way more than what they give me. This is the source of profit on Marxist theory. They're always going to pay you a certain baseline amount, and they're only going to keep you around so long as your labor is capable of putting more value, of transforming raw materials in such a way that they're scarce and that they command a certain value. What determines the bottom line value of labor? Two things, one primary, one secondary. The primary thing that determines the value of labor, and here Marx is like, this is true for every commodity, is how much does it cost to produce that labor. So hypothetically, I'm highly trained, right? Like I went to a lot of school. I can talk fancy, that's my skill. The more training it requires to make a laborer, probably the more the labor of that laborer is worth. And the bottom line is, okay, you gotta at least pay and here we're like, really the logic of the capitalist and the logic of the slave owner on Haiti are identical. You gotta pay the worker enough to make sure that the worker shows up at the door the next day. So they gotta be able to be sheltered, they gotta be able to be clothed, they gotta be able to deal with at least minimal health care, probably only minimal health care, and they have to eat. And then if you extend this out, well, it's not just that you need the worker to show up at the door the next day, you also need the next generation of workers to show up at the door the next day. And so that means that you have to pay them enough to feed their kids because you're just producing more labor. That's the bottom line. They're just going to pay you enough to live. And think what happens with that money too, right? Enough to live basically means they give you a check, you feel accomplished, back up. You go to work before you get paid, right? That means you give your labor to the capitalist, the boss, on credit. You're loaning him value. And then at the end of the 2-week cycle or whatever it is, you're hoping that he comes good on his promise to pay. And then you get your paycheck. But then what happens with that paycheck? Go back to Dickens. The money trickles up. You have to pay your landlord. You have to pay your phone company. You have to pay your car insurance. You have to pay your car payment. And all of these things is totally necessary in order for you to live, right? It's not like you really have a choice. Then you're broke again. What do you have to do? You got to go back to work. And, God forbid you lose work because you're going to be fucked. That's the condition of the proletariat. They're continually kept at a subsistence level. And even the money, the value that they do get is always just being transferred. They're a way station between one capitalist and another. That's the proletariat. And that's the basis of the value of labor. But then what happens when they put you to work? Well, they have you work for much longer than they let you work long enough to produce enough value that it goes above what you cost. So it's those extra hours of work that they effectively do not pay you for. And all workers work more than they're paid for. It's that extra increment, couple hours out of every day, few hours out of every day. Work at home, work on your phone. It's that constitutes profit. It's the difference between what we cost and what we can produce. No other commodity, according to Marx, has this characteristic. So the capitalists extract labor from us. Some of this labor goes to produce capital, which they take for themselves. So the radical Marxist and then anarchist view on this stuff is, and that becomes like, private property in the biggest sense, the power to control the labor of others and so on. This comes from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, an early anarchist who Marx refers to too. The phrase is property is theft. Where does capital come from? It comes from the working people. We make it. But where does it go to? It goes to the rich. That means that every single day of your work is exploitation. That's the meaning of exploitation, that they don't pay you what you're worth. They take some of the value that you produce in the world, the changes to the physical world, your making of things. They take that and they make it their own. And so the harder I work, the richer they get, and the more profoundly am I subjugated. This is the Marxist view. Now back to the proletariat. The proletariat in a technical sense is not the entirety of people who lack access to the means of production. Hold on a second, my wife is calling. Sorry, domestic duties called me there for a second. Let's see, so where was I? I was talking about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Oh, I left one thing out. I said that there were two factors determining the wage, the minimum wage. One factor was the basic cost of reproducing the worker. The secondary variable, or secondary factor, is the one that corresponds to labor movements. So if there have been long-term labor movements in a particular place, it's very likely that the wage will be higher than elsewhere. Or as Marx puts it elsewhere, in England you got to pay your workers enough to buy beer. In France you got to pay them enough to buy wine. Maybe that's not even related. But if there have been labor movements, the minimum wage will have gone up. And then the special thing about the proletariat is that the proletariat is specially positioned within the industrial apparatus, within the productive apparatus, insofar as those workers actually run those factories, actually run those machines. And so they already know how the system of production works. Now, if you think historically about the growth of capitalist industry globally, it makes networks across the whole world, physical networks with ships and eventually communications networks. As time goes on, these distant places on the globe are effectively closer and closer together, not only in terms of their accessibility, that you can go there more easily or you can call them up, but also in terms of their interconnectedness. They increasingly rely upon raw materials and parts from all over the globe. So the globe is increasingly interrelated in all these ways. And the way that Marx saw this was that capitalism, you can hear a weird respect for capitalism, I think, even in the Communist Manifesto, that capitalism has produced this huge productive force, this ability to produce so many goods, to produce so many tools for making more tools. It's industrialized the whole face of the planet, and Marx loves this. He thinks it's awesome. But the problem is that big interconnected global thing with the proletariat positioned in all the key points is still owned by the capitalists. The whole thing is used for producing this regular surplus value, which is profit, and continually empowering this tiny little elite, which is always getting smaller, and the proletariat is always getting larger. But these people are always getting more and more powerful. They have more and more capital. They have more and more ability to influence things. And of course, these people can travel all over the world. Each one of these proletarians is stuck where they started. So the way that Marx thought about this was that capitalism produces contradictions. It produces tensions which are going to explode it one day. And one of those contradictions is that it is effectively socializing industry. Industry is more and more interconnected. It's more and more one system which could be rationally administered so as to produce for the real needs of the people and according to the wishes of the people. The apparatus that capitalism produces, or think now, especially now that so much stuff is automated, automation should mean that people just don't have to work very much. I mean, if you can make the things that people need to live without them working very much, why the fuck should they work very much? But we work ever more because, on the one hand, the capitalist greed is unlimited, it's fundamentally irrational. And on the other hand, there's a need for the ruling class to keep the working class in disciplinary situations. So we work so much, not really because it's necessary in order to live. Well, it is the way things are set up, but not because it's necessary in order to produce the amount of goods that are necessary for the population to live, but rather because they need to keep us somewhere where they can control us. And if we have free time, we might speak with one another and we might talk about changing things. And at the same time, Marx thought, and this is a place where I think he's wrong, or at least he was way too simplistic. I think too simplistic. The other thing is that, all the time, this 1%, or this 1% of the 1%, is getting more and more powerful with respect to the proletarians. Meanwhile, the proletarians, the workers, their conditions are getting worse and worse and worse. And people who used to be petty bourgeois, who used to own like this one house that they could rent, the tendency of capitalism is to force them down into the proletariat, to like rip away that asset that they had as like monopolization and concentration of wealth goes on. So the wealthy get wealthier and wealthier, the poor get poorer and poorer, and as they get poorer and poorer, now we're back in considerations like we dealt with in Haiti, that suffering is really happening. And so all these things together meant that Marx and Engels thought capitalism would produce its own grave diggers. It was exploding itself. It was an historical process that had to be passed through in order to develop all this technology and infrastructure and roadways and shipping lanes and all this stuff had to be passed through. But it involved increasing suffering for the vast majority of the globe, and it was bound to result, and of course it does, result in intermittent revolutions all over the globe. But what has not yet happened is that these revolutions, these revolutionary movements, have gotten into synchronization with one another and turned themselves into a global revolution. But Marx thought it's only a matter of time before that happens. Okay, so I'll give you briefly, what is communism and what does Marx want to do, and then I'll give you the theory of ideology, and then that'll be it. Okay, so Marx is a communist, Engels is a communist, Lenin is a communist, Trotsky is a communist, and they have a very specific idea what this means. Technically speaking, communism is a system in which the means of production are controlled by the workers themselves. And on the happiest view, this would mean that every locality, every place of work, every shop, every school would be run by the people who work there. This is never exactly what Marx had in mind, however, because that's an anarchist vision. If all the power were really down at the very bottom and every locality governed itself, Marx's scientific management would not have a place. So really what Marx envisions and what becomes kind of state communism in Russia and in China and in a certain way in Cuba is a centralization of powers where the leadership is just an expert leadership. It's not dominating, he doesn't think. It's just making rational decisions. It's the best people at calculating who are going to be in the center place. So everything in Marx's view is going to be centralized. So the means of production are going to be taken away from the capitalists. Production will no longer be used in order to generate profit, which is really important. Production will happen along rational lines with a good plan. And ultimately, as time goes along, the remnants of state forces, which are going to be necessary to begin with in order to keep the enemy's to keep old capitalists from coming back into power with their nasty capitalist allies in the United States or whatever. And for more on this, wait for Lenin. Eventually, those state forces, the prisons and the cops and the military, they're going to wither away. And at some point distant in the future, there's going to be this happy situation where there's an integrated, centralized, productive scenario where somehow, this is what I don't quite understand, somehow in principle the workers themselves will be in charge of their own machinery, even though in actuality decisions about production and who's going to work where and what's going to be made are going to come from a central location. So I dig Marx and his critique. This is what I always tell people, I think you can break Marx in half. And Marx's critique of capitalism, I think, is unparalleled. And the anarchists buy it entirely. They don't make their own critique. They think Marx did it. But the recommendations, when you start really looking at the recommendations, the idea about centralization and state control and Politburo control, those to me seem somewhat problematic. I'm not super down with them. Anyway, what's a communist? A communist is someone who is oriented towards that project. But the Communist Party, of which Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky were all parts, they considered themselves to be the vanguard of the working class. Vanguard means like the advanced sections, like a military term. And they thought, and we'll see this more with Lenin, this is something dangerous to me. They thought they knew better than the rest of the working class what the general situation was, what needed to be done. And they were acting on behalf of the working class and the interests of the working class. But of course, a lot of the working class didn't recognize what these communists were up to as their own interests. And there's a problem. Okay, so I'll leave that there. There's one more theory that I can find that's in the Communist Manifesto at a couple of different places, and it's also elsewhere, which I think is really important for our class and for thinking about our own common sense and our own predispositions, including the predisposition to think that communism is stupid, state socialism is totalitarian and ugly, and capitalism is way better. Now, I don't think communism is stupid. I think state socialism may often be ugly. But none of those things proves that capitalism is the only answer. I also think that Marx's analysis of capitalism is correct in its irrationality, its irrational growth, its tendency to produce ever greater distance between the rich and the poor, its tendency to produce suffering, and it's being driven by an exploitation of workers. Nowadays, in the United States, we like to think that workers are relatively comfortable. At least they can be plugged into their TV and shut up a lot. There is real poverty in the U.S. still. But, of course, the suffering has just largely been offshored. So there's, suffering on the same order as, 1860s England now happens in Indonesia. But we don't have to see it. Okay, theory of ideology. The theory of ideology is a theory about what ideas, what philosophies, what religions, what manner of common sense. Hey, Evan, that's my son over there. Do you want to stick your head in the camera and say hi to the class? No. What dominant ideas are there? How do those things become dominant? How do we get, an era where, so nowadays maybe we have a resurgence of religion to some extent, but we also have a largely secular society where, most people think religion is kind of metaphorical, but they believe in science. But we also tend to believe that capitalism is the only system that works, that freedom and free trade are basically the same thing. Most people, even though they don't like religion, they tend to believe in God in one way or the other. And I'm just saying what I take to be some common positions within the United States. We tend to think that democracy and representative democracy are the same thing, that what we've got is democracy, that that's the best form of government for the world, that we have a right to export it. There are all kinds of generally shared opinions, and the theory of ideology asks the question, how do these become the dominant opinions? And the answer is given on a materialist basis. Here's how it goes. The answer is, the ruling ideas are always the ideas of the ruling class, the ideas of their rule. This is the way that Marx puts it in both the German ideology and in the Communist Manifesto. The ruling ideas are always the ideas of the rulers. and in some kind of form, in some kind of potentially veiled form. Why is that the case? My son is playing drums, but I'm trying to make a... The answer goes like this. It says, okay, think back to who the ruling class is. The ruling class, by definition, is the class that controls the means of production. But if you're a materialist, or even if you're just really thinking about it in any practical, honest way, you will have to realize that ideas don't just come from nowhere. You might say that people have ideas. We've got this is a capitalist and American way of thinking that, people like Thomas Edison, just, the light bulb appeared over their head and voila, we have a new invention. This is not a thesis about invention, but it's a thesis about general ideas. Like, how did I get the idea growing up that Christianity and Jesus Christ are like really important, but Muhammad is like some kind of sideshow and not important? How to get there? Well, because I was raised in a Christian family, because I was raised in a Christian town, because I went to churches. We get our ideas from places. We get them from churches, we get them from schools, we get them from our family, we get them from the communities that we're around, we get them from the place where we work. But there's also a media idea distribution apparatus. Books. Why do repressive governments ban and burn certain books? Well, because the distribution of books produces ideas, and ideas are related to action. So the ruling class, insofar as they are the ruling class, they own the means of production. But if they own all the means of production, then that means that they also own the means of the production of ideas. They own the printing presses. They own the television stations. They own the streaming outlets. They own the satellites. They own the production studios. They own the cell phone towers. They therefore have the capacity, not necessarily to construct or to create, but to modulate and to limit the ideas that are broadly distributed. Because they control production, they also control the production of the vehicles of ideas. As a result, what tends to happen in every circumstance, in the feudal period, for example, we had dominant ideology in Europe, which is probably most easily expressed in the philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who describes the entirety of the universe as being built in this pyramidal structure with God at the top, and then we've got angels, and then we've got saints, and then we've got, kings, and then lords and archbishops, way down to people, and then pigs, and then worms, and then dirt. Chain of being, great chain of being it's called. That just happens to match exactly the structure of rule and ownership that existed in that feudal period. Now, is that a coincidence? For Marx, absolutely not. The ideology which gets accepted and distributed, and in this case, the question of the control of the production of ideology would be control over the production of the monastery system, in large part, and of the churches. Control on a material basis is always augmented and supported by control on a mental basis. And that's possible because mental stuff is distributed by physical means. So every period tends to produce an ideology that basically naturalizes the given situation. So when Aquinas tells the parishioners in 1300 France that this is the way the world is built, with this hierarchy, and then the parishioners have to deal with their lord and the armed men that he sends to make sure that they hand over the right amount of their crop, they feel that this is natural. Every period produces an ideology which tends to confirm the naturalness of the arrangements of power at that time. So the general effect, the general function of ideology is to make us think that how things are now, we got capitalism, we got alleged democracy, we got, American supremacy, all this stuff. Ideology convinces us to believe that that's natural. That's just the way it has to be. Like, to go against that would be to be utopian, would be to be silly. And this means that ideology produces a certain falsification, because it's never the case that the way things are is the way that they actually have to be forever. Everything is always changing. There are multiple forces that are pushing against one another. Structures are changing all the time. Social relations are changing all the time. Even the changes of technology in production change the jobs that are available, which means changing the hierarchical relationships which exist. We're always in constant flux. So the way things are now is by no means the way that it always has to be. In fact, it's already in the process of stopping being this. Moreover, what got us here was not just some natural process that could not have been otherwise. It was a series of contingent changes. And if we start realizing the historical basis of change and the reality that there are different possible configurations today, that opens up the whole space of action. That opens up the whole world where we could be thinking about changing things. The function of ideology, the function of the common sense, where this is where you can know that you're dealing with an ideological thought, is that you just say, well, it's obvious that. Shit that is just obvious and that you don't have to think about and you don't care to give a reason for, that's ideology. And this shit that is just obvious, that's just the way that it is, it has a role. It reflects, in a certain way, the system of production that is in place and the system of property ownership. It puts that stuff into kind of general, abstract, theoretical terms. But then those ideas, when we receive them, they cause our behavior to change. They modulate our behavior. They make it so that okay, well, I guess I just have to find, one of these industrial sectors where I can fit. I shouldn't be thinking about how do I make something other. I shouldn't be thinking about the injustice of the whole system. I shouldn't be thinking about revolution, because things just can't be any other way. But if you get past ideology, and that is the purpose of critique, and that's one function and one purpose of a class like this, is to start to see that ideology is ideology, that it has no ground, that those things that are just obvious, we don't have a reason for believing they're obvious. When we get through that and we start to see that in history, all these patterns are changing. Across the world, all these patterns are differentiated. It really is the case. And even within itself, any given capitalist system involves a whole bunch of different contradictions. Technology develops faster, for example, than social relations. This is the way that Marx explains localized revolutions. When the forces of production and the relations of production get out of whack, you get revolutions. But my general point is that even a local situation involves contradictions. It's not a rational system. It's a turbulent and changing situation. And once we start to get our heads around these facts and start to really become, there's a bug on the lens, really start to become critical about what we have always been told, then we're moving into a position where we're much more capable of critique and much more capable of revolt. Of course, there's something missing, and that's what Thoreau talked about. That is the movement into action. It's hard to give up on common sense that you always just thought was true without actually thinking about it. It's hard to start thinking. Thinking to me means attempting to put parts into a whole and to break holes into parts, and figuring out what are key problems around you and seeking to answer and turning those into questions and seeking to answer them. That's thought. Thought is better than common, just lethargy, just being guided by what everybody says is true, having the mainstream media idea of patriotism and supporting therefore everything that the armies do, having a mainstream idea about capitalism and supporting therefore anything that the corporations do, even as it rapes the general population. That sucks. Being a thinking being is better than that. By the way, it also will make you less happy if more invigorated. But it's stupid to be happy in a world that's fucked. But moving from thought to action, that's another thing too. And that's something we're going to talk about. I'll refer back to Thoreau, but we'll talk about it especially when we come to say Fanon.